That's the problem when people are either like China bad, China good, one of the two. Like no country is good or bad. Most countries are shit, but most of them are a mix of things. You should be looking towards the things within that country that work well and are just and ameliorate the lives for the most amount of people that give, like, you know, the workers of the world the most rights and powers. I don't know why this has been the focal point for so long now on the left. I was quite curious as to why everyone on the left is talking about this on a regular basis. I think it has been ignited by that recent Mel and Vosh debate, which was a dumpster fire of internet proportions, to say the very least. But it keeps bringing up this fight that is going on between two sides of the left, between people who say that China is a communist utopia and one that should be emulated by all, and others who realize that's delusional and China is in no way communist and is actually a capitalist juggernaut on the world stage. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. But that being said, every single one of you in the comfort of your homes, most likely, could be in a country that is also involved in some shady shit. And my biggest piece of advice when it comes to all of this is that you probably don't have the power to enact any kind of change in China. I'm going to guess. Unless you are watching this from behind a firewall somewhere, in which case I take that back. You have a lot more power than what I'm expressing here. But most likely you're probably watching this in America or Canada or New Zealand or somewhere else. I'm not entirely sure. But wherever you're watching this, most likely locally, the country that you're a part of is doing something shitty. Unfortunately, that seems to be the odds. There's not many that have clean hands, you know. There's not a lot that aren't Hamlet in some way, you know. So basically, what I'm going to do is express and explain why what I believe is occurring in Xinjiang is tantamount to, or no, is cultural genocide. It's very similar to the program enacted within Canada for years called the residential school system. In Canada, basically what had happened is that the quote-unquote Indian problem, and I use that in quotation marks because it's a racist epitaph to refer to Indigenous people, but what was seen as the Indian problem in Canada, one of the solutions rather than the outright extermination of Indigenous people, was to try and assimilate them into Canadian culture. And part of doing that would be to take them literally from their mother's arms. They were ripped from their mother's arms and they were placed into these school programs called residential schools. These were done across the entire country, federally. Within the residential school system, the children were tortured, they were sexually abused. In the most notorious one, there was an actual electrical chair as a form of punishment, not to kill them, but just to scare them and shock them a little bit. They were horrifying, and it's one of the darkest parts of Canada's history and legacy. One of the most horrifying parts being that they didn't end until like 1991, which is obscenely fucked up. And so that's something that has obviously had a ripple effect through the damage and the PTSD that has occurred to the people in it. But the idea within these schools, in the residential school system of Canada, was to erase the idea of anything that could be seen as Indigenous culture, to erase their Indigenous names. Their names were removed and they were given proper Christian names, to erase their Indigenous culture, to erase their Indigenous language, which would have been really, really fucked up because there is no written history in Indigenous cultures. There's storytellers in bands, and those are the people who are supposed to memorize and learn all the stories to teach to the next generation and so forth and so forth. So by eliminating language and eliminating that effectively, you would erase their entire history. It is quite frankly a genocide. You're trying to culturally erase an ethnicity off the face of the earth so that it no longer exists. Luckily, they were not successful in doing so. But make no mistake, it's not something that human beings aren't capable of doing and aren't actively trying to do right now. In fact, the genocide of Indigenous people in Canada hasn't stopped. By definition, it's still happening because there are still cases of women coming forward and saying that they are getting unwanted pressure from Canadian doctors within the public healthcare system to become unable to have children anymore. Basically, the forced sterilization of Indigenous women is still happening. And as long as that's still happening, Canada's doing a genocide. There's just no way to sugarcoat it. But there's no UN resolution on that right now. There's no mass condemnation from other nations. I've not seen Americans come up in arms and say we have to end the genocide in Canada. I haven't seen any country say that, actually, because actively there's a lot more concentrated effort on China. And that's unfortunately for a lot of political reasons. I'm sure everyone here understands the geopolitical tension that is happening right now between the US and China, between Canada and China, because we happen to say, okay, America, we're going to detain one of the CEOs of Huawei for you. And as a result, China is effectively super, super pissed off at Canada right now. But anyways, conservatives in Canada have effectively put forth a motion that got voted on to characterize what is going on in Xinjiang as a genocide, and America has signed off on the same thing, despite a report coming out from the State Department of America that didn't say that they can necessarily classify what's happening there as a genocide that would be a distinct cleansing of an ethnic minority or an intentional removal of an ethnic minority through various means. But cultural genocide definitely qualifies. So, before I get all, the tankies mad at me, the quote-unquote tankies of the internet, the sources for this come directly from the state. We're going to go directly from the state. Here we go. CGTN, all right? Their own website in English. Thank you for translating this. Challenges of fighting terrorism in Xinjiang, the enemies within. Now, allow me to give everyone a quick history lesson, all right? Xinjiang was kind of a nation within a nation inside China. It was an autonomous area of China, and it has a mostly Turkish people who are predominantly Muslim. For a long time, it was just seen similar to nations within nations that you have in other parts of the world, such as Quebec in Canada or Catalonia in Spain. After the death of Mao Zedong, a very large influx of predominantly Han Chinese started migrating to the region. As that happened, and as there was more people migrating to Xinjiang, there became some conflict. That is typically what happens when there's a mass amount of people moving into a new location. No one is above the fray. Elements of what would now be deemed as terrorist organizations were capable of galvanizing individuals who were feeling malcontent or discontent at what had been happening. And then by the 1990s, there was quite a few terrorist attacks taking place all across China. China then responded, as most nation states do, by cracking down even harder upon the people, the ethnic minority people in Xinjiang, which in turn created more terrorism, which in turn created more crackdowns. I don't know if you've ever heard this story before, because it seems to be one that happens every single time state power exudes or tries to control a populace. Terrorism begets terrorism. Anger begets anger. This is not new. It's very similar to what happens in the good old US of A when they meddle in the Middle East. Very, very similar.
Hotan was one of the hardest hit by terrorism in Xinjiang. Murat Shekbujang showed us the weaponry seized.
The propaganda being put out by the Communist Party of China in regards to what is happening there, incredibly similar to American propaganda. When you see things like terrorism, 9/11, they hate our freedom, all that kind of shit. The war in the shadows, the challenges of fighting Xinjiang terrorism, very, very similar. Great production value, very scary music, hour-long documentaries. Tears. And by the way, I'm not trying to downplay in any way the losses that are occurring to people who are affected by terrorism. It's the exact same thing as me saying that, yes, 9/11 was a horrible, horrifying thing. But it is a perpetual cycle. The more terrorism occurs in any one region, the more they crack down on it, the more it seems to perpetuate. And again, the same thing is similar to what happens with the US and the Middle East. Now, because of that, they have passed a number of different resolutions. So I'm going to be using exclusively their own words, just because I don't want to, again, be accused of using state propaganda. This is going to be directly from the state. So this is translated from a website called China Law Translate. It does exactly what it's advertised to do. So if you go to China Law Translate, you'll be able to see any number of Chinese laws directly translated as close as they can, does what it says on the title of the website. And it's a great source if you want to read up on these laws without getting the Western propaganda spin on any of it. This directly comes from their own laws. So they passed something called the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region Regulation on De-extremification. So by classifying certain people as extremists within a certain region, they're able to then put them into what are now being called the internment camps. They do not call them that, of course. They're called re-education centers in China, naturally. But the general provisions are as follows. This regulation is drafted on the basis of the Constitution of the People's Republic of China, the Anti-Terrorism Law of the People's Republic of China, the States Council Religious Affairs Regulation, and other relevant laws and regulations together with the actual conditions of the autonomous region so as to contain and eradicate extremification, prevent extremist violations, and bring about social stability and lasting peace and order. This regulation shall apply to de-extremification of the administrative areas of the autonomous region. Extremification as used in the regulation refers to speech and actions under the influence of extremism that imbue radical religious ideology and reject and interfere with normal production and livelihood. Unfortunately, very broad. Very broad, similar to the Patriot Act of the United States, right? The broader you make the language of these laws, the more effective you're going to be, honestly, more malicious you will be able to effectively enact the regulations that you're trying to pass. De-extremification efforts are to employ leadership responsibility systems and annual target responsibility evaluation system. Now, here's where things go off the rails, in my opinion. Chapter 2, Primary Expressions of Extremification. Article 9. The following words and actions under the influence of extremism and extremification are to be prohibited. Advocating or spreading extremist thinking. Does not define what extremist thinking is, though. So again, very broad. Very broad. Interfering with others' freedom of religion by forcing others to participate in religious activities, forcing others to supply properties or labor services to religious activity sites or religious professionals. Interfering with activities such as others' weddings or funerals or inheritance. Interfering with others from having communication, exchanges, mixing with or living with persons of other ethnicities or faiths, or driving persons of other ethnicities or faiths to leave their homes. Interfering with cultural and recreational activities, rejecting or refusing public goods or services such as radio or television. This is the first one that should be very frightening to you, especially if, again, you are someone on the left who's trying to advocate for, I don't know, a moneyless, classless, stateless society. Interfering with cultural and recreational activities, including rejecting services such as radio and television, aka state propaganda or state TV, you are not allowed to reject. And if you do so, you can be labeled as an extremist. This is not me pushing CIA propaganda. This is not me trying to push on some very radical view on you. This is directly from their own laws from the Chinese government, okay? So again, if you want to defend this as being some kind of communist utopia, uwu, or anything like that, no, that's not the case. It's very clearly written here. Use this as a reference, by the way. Please don't use Adrian Zenz. Adrian Zenz is a McCarthy-level crackpot who's batshit crazy and thinks that he's going to win some ideological war over the communists. It is very clear in his writing. He is religiously orthodox. Adrian Zenz is a huge piece of shit. If you are reading an article, whether it be The Guardian, The New York Times, The Washington Post, doesn't matter the source, if it includes Adrian Zenz at any point, people are going to be able to throw that back at you very easily and be like, oh yeah, Adrian Zenz, right? And then it's like, well, fuck. It's not like the things that he's expressing, such as quoting directly from Chinese law itself, is a problem, but you can just go straight to the source. Skip Adrian Zenz, skip the New York Times article that sources him, and go right to, again, the laws of the land. Okay, generalizing the concept of halal to make halal expand into areas beyond halal foods, and using the idea of being not halal to reject and interfere with other secular lives. Wearing or compelling others to wear gowns with face coverings or to bear symbols of extremification. Spreading religious fanaticism through irregular beards or name selection. Can I read that one out again? Yeah, even France doesn't go this far. Even France doesn't ban what it considers Muslim beards. Okay? Spreading religious fanaticism through irregular beards or name selection. AKA, if your name is Muhammad, the most popular name on the planet, you can now qualify as being an extremist. These are so broad, so sweeping, right? That now they have basically the legal authority to arrest and detain and then imprison anyone based on those qualifications. Because you've got an irregular beard, apparently. Failing to perform the legal formalities of marrying or divorcing by religious methods, not allowing children to receive public education, obstructing the implementation of the national education system. Like that's you know, that one sounds a little more normal. Intentionally damaging or destroying public or private property, publishing, printing, distributing, selling, producing, downloading, sorting, reproducing, accessing, copying, or possessing articles, publications, audio, or video with extremification content. Because you've made the broad definition of extremification, things like having the wrong beard, then again, anything related to that, if you were to, say, sing a song or publish a magazine that had a picture of that, things like that, now all loops in with extremification. This is what I would call extreme. I mean, it just says other speech and acts as, like, number 15 is virtually anything. Number 15, other speech and acts of extremification. Meaning what? Meaning anything they determine. So that is incredibly fucked up. Now, primary duties of the government. Okay, now here's Here's where this would be the part that I would reference if you want to see how exactly the government sees both itself and its vision. And again, this is the vision of the CCP. So when people talk about and or stand the CCP as being some kind of benevolent socialist utopia, this is again in the way they view themselves, because this is in their own words. Article 30. All aspects of society shall jointly participate in de-extremification efforts. So everyone. So every single member of society has to be a part of this. Every ethnic group shall study and follow the law and build identification with great motherland, the Chinese people, Chinese culture, the Communist Party of China, and socialism with Chinese characteristics, increasing awareness of the state, citizens, law, and the community of Chinese ethnicities, practicing the core socialist values, and conscientiously resisting and staying clear of extremification. So there it is. Very, very clear. It's laid out very, very clearly there. Trade unions shall carry out publicly an education in union organizations amongst the members of the laws, regulation, and policies. Communist youth leagues shall carry out the education on ethnic, religious policies and relevant laws and regulations. Women's federations shall conduct cultural education of women, strengthen the education and management of women influenced by the extremification. The Association of Science and Technology shall spread scientific knowledge for the entire public, promote the scientific spirit, transmit scientific thought, advocate scientific methods, tell the story of science, and guide every ethnic group to embrace scientific, healthy, and civilized lifestyles and means to produce and increase the scientific awareness and consciousness resistance in opposition to the extremism. I'm not saying, by the way, that the actions of the terrorist organizations taking place, those the people who they kill or bomb, because those aren't taking place, in any way should be downplayed. They shouldn't. But I think it should be paid close attention to. You don't have to engage in xenophobia or racist characterizations of what is actually occurring there. Why not just use, again, their direct sources? And they say it in their own words. The news carried out of Xinjiang, China's western region, this summer has been a steady stream of Orwellian horrors. A million people being held against their will in political re-education camps, intelligence officials assigned as adopted members of civilian families, checkpoints on every corner, and mandatory spyware installed on devices. The targets of this police state are the Muslim Uyghur minority, whose loyalties in the central government have long been distrusted for both nationalist and religious reasons. An already messy relationship deteriorated further in 2009, when Uyghur protests led to violent riots and retaliatory crackdowns. Hundreds died in the clashes and were disappeared by security forces in their aftermath. Since then, a handful of deadly terrorist attacks outside of Xinjiang itself have served to justify the increasingly heavy restrictions on the group's rights and freedoms. The Uyghurs are a problem for China, and perhaps an intractable one. They are reluctant subjects of the Chinese state. They sit en route, most key to Xi Jinping's signature Belt and Road Initiative, and increasing opposition has so far only prompted further resistance. But as far as we know, China isn't massacring the Uyghurs. This is not to say that the repression hasn't been violent. It has. Members of the security forces are committing torture and extrajudicial killings with impunity, but there's no evidence that China's systematically employing lethal violence in an effort to physically eradicate the Uyghur minority. What they are doing, and again, I think it's very akin to the cultural genocide taking place in Canada, is they are putting them into what are called re-education centers. These centers are distinctly built to remove what they see as extremism. Extremism is so broadly defined here that it is quite akin to removing a lot of religious, cultural aspects of their society. It's more extreme, say, than France went. And France, I already am deeply against the fact that they want to ban, say, anything related to religious wear, which is directly their way of pretty much banning things like burqas and niqabs, which, don't get me wrong, I'm not for the religious oppression of women, but I still don't think it's on a government to say whether or not you can wear something based on the fact that you clearly have a problem with Muslims, right? That happens to be what they're doing. Now, these centers, unfortunately, also get a lot of negative. Like, you're not helping anything if you're sharing photos from things that have no relation and can get debunked easily, especially by people on the internet. Like, if you share photos and you're like, hey, look at how terrible they're being treated, and it's pictures that are made from a protest and people are covering ketchup or stuff like that, which is happening quite a bit. You know, there's a whole collection of fake pictures submitted about what is going on. You don't have to spread lies about what's occurring when really it's occurring on a scale. They are doing these re-education camps. It is written and codified into their law, and it's honestly it's as frightening as something like the Patriot Act is to me. To have articles like this in which, you know, it's written directly in there. Number 8, spreading religious fanaticism through irregular beards or name selection. I mean, it's pretty clear what the intent is, you know? Liberté, égalité, fraternité. Anyways, if you want to share this link, because rather than post Adrian Zen stuff, you can just post the actual laws itself as written by the Chinese. On the other end, by the way, it seems like a large body of American right-wingers are very, very excited about pushing the narrative consistently that this is a genocide and that it's a genocide taking place. It's the worst genocide in human history. It's like 1 million Holocausts all put into one. Every single one of you needs to do everything in your power to end it. By the by, in terms of the border, let's not bring up what's going on there, because you know that's just a processing center, and those are just people being put into happiness training centers for kids. So that's very different, You know, that's very different. Don't think about that one. Don't talk about that one either. Oh shit, I didn't even talk about this. Let me play this clip.
Oh, they're always on the side of bombing, but that's not what we do at this show here. We debunk that kind of shit. We bring on people like Danny Haifong to do it. Danny, any last thing you'd like to say? So I think people got the message that the people that the Uyghurs in the United States, the Uyghur Congress, they're all funded by people in the pocket of the military-industrial complex. I know that. Now, I don't know exactly what's going on in China, but I know that. And I know that if someone uses the Uyghurs as a reason to ramp up a Cold War or some kind of they care more about the Uyghurs than they do about the people in their own goddamn country, you know they're full of shit. All right, Danny, anything else you'd like to say before we say goodbye?
I agree with the second part. I definitely agree with the second part. I think anyone who's just saber rattling and being like, I care so much about this atrocity without ever talking about the atrocities taking place on U.S. soil, that part is true. The first part is just next level batshittery. What the fuck are you saying? That people who, like Uyghurs who live in America, let me play that one more time. I don't want to misconstrue your arguments here, sir. Oh, Jack Dorsey, always fucking me over.
That the people that the Uyghurs in the United States, the Uyghur Congress, they're all funded by people in the pocket of the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, that's bold. That's bold and strange, even for Jimmy Dore. What the fuck? Like, all of us want, I think, the same thing ultimately, right? We want to end the military-industrial complex, just as an entirety. I would like to eliminate it from the face of the earth. But it does a disservice if you spread strange rumors like that. Like the cultural genocide taking place in Xinjiang is real. It's absolutely real. Again, you have but to reference the own laws that China has passed, the ones I was bringing up earlier. Don't do this.
Now, I don't know exactly what's going on in China, but I know that.
Then again, research it. And yes, it is being used and weaponized by the right for, yes, the military-industrial complex. That doesn't mean the people who are giving firsthand testimonies about this are necessarily lying. I mean, there's a very good collection the UBC archives have put together, the University of British Columbia, of all the credible testimonies, and in which case, in this point, there are hundreds of them. Hundreds and hundreds of credible testimonies from firsthand accounts of people. This isn't the same thing as saying that every single one of them is by definition suddenly a CIA op to you.
And I know that if someone uses the Uyghurs as a reason to ramp up a Cold War or some kind of they care more about the Uyghurs than they do about the people in their own goddamn country, you know they're full of shit. All right, Danny, anything else you'd like to say before we say goodbye?
Sure. So, I mean, there are a couple of points that I think are important to note. Is that the United States always seems to be concerned about human rights when the concern isn't really valid. I mean, even if you read Adrian Zenz, for example, read his studies on forced birth control, for example, you see many different citations that lead directly to sources which actually give you a more rosy picture of what's happening in Xinjiang.
So what he's referencing is that Adrian Zenz was using birth rates, which would demonstrate, according to official Chinese sources, that they have been increasing, that there's more Uyghurs living now in that region than there was before. So by definition, this can't be anything tantamount to a genocide, which is often used, I think, to try and debunk it. Like I've said, Adrian Zenz, just as an actor, is incredibly bad faith. He's a horrible person. He is McCarthy-era scaremongering to the highest degree. However, his sources, when you track them down to their root, oftentimes aren't as spurious as everyone puts them out to be. And I have no interest in defending Adrian Zenz. I will fully say that, yes, he is a right-wing nutjob, but you can look to other sources beyond him, and you shouldn't use him as a blanket statement to then disparage everything else, including firsthand testimonies, which would be the other thing that I would bring up.
For example, that the population in Xinjiang, the Uyghur population, has actually risen 25%. It's a very strange genocide, right? Most genocides have reductions in population and huge migrations, right, of people. out of the particular place. How is it that the United States has any kind of moral, political, or any other kind of authority to talk about genocide or even concentration camps when the United States actually built and put Japanese residents and citizens into concentration camps during World War II and justified it with the same virulent anti-Asian racism that is now fueling and is now...
Yeah, but like... So if your country is committing atrocities, like mine is, Canada, for example, that doesn't mean that you all of a sudden are not allowed to call out anything else. Like, can you suddenly not speak about what's going on in India to the Muslim minorities there? Can you not talk about the Rohingya refugee problem? I think there's a big difference between I'm a right winger. I want a saber rattle. I want a strong man. I want us to go into a Cold War with China. And here's my reason and justification for it. All I see is genocide, 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 genocide. And by the way, I'm not going to look at anything that's happening domestically. Okay. Whereas you can easily look at this and be like, yeah, America is very, very bad and China is very, very bad. Both governments are doing horrific and horrifying things. America is worse. I'm sorry to say, Americans, but it is on the world stage in terms of a superpower. America is like the big swinging dick of the jingoistic world. They have more military bases than any other country by a monstrous margin. It's 600 to 700 US foreign military bases. Their geopolitical interests are vast and powerful. That's not to say suddenly, by me stating that China is suddenly forgiven for anything that they do, right? Like, you have to be able to state that, yes, China has been trying to exploit certain countries in Africa. They've done a better job than America has, however, because China has forgiven so much more debt than America has when doing development projects in African nations. But they still have built a military base in Djibouti, for example, which is not something that I would suddenly say screams, benevolent imperial superpower that a lot of people like to say China is. Or you can speak to people who live in the Philippines, for example, who are suddenly very concerned at the fact that China is trying to acquire more and more of their sea by building artificial islands. I mean, that is very concerning. And if I bring that up to someone who's a Chinese, defender, they'll usually say, well, those are just border disputes. Those are just border disputes. I mean, is this just semantics then? Are we just being as pedantic as possible? We're just going to go back and forth, and I call something out as basically trying to take advantage of another area, and suddenly it's a border dispute. Like these things
being used to justify this new Cold War. So I guess I'll close with that, and you all know where to follow me.
So I don't know, Danny. I don't want to follow you. I'm getting sick of your apologetics for that, those genociders over in China.
Well, the CCP doesn't pay enough, so make sure you subscribe to my Patreon.
Awkward time to plug. Yeah. Propaganda is when you correctly report on what happened, but don't use enough adverbs. I don't know who accelerationist for Biden is. I guess this is one of those secret accounts, but they do a good job of always holding Jimmy Dore to task. I'll be honest. I'll be honest about that. You don't need a Cold War to end it. Yeah, but at the same time, here's my main statement, because right now that seems to be the only genocide that people talk about on the internets. And frankly, I don't hear people talking about the concern for Muslims in India very frequently. I don't hear them talking about the Rohingya people very frequently. It's often always Xinjiang, and that's the only place where Muslims are being persecuted. And it's not. You have but to look to America if you live in America, right? And I keep saying America, but Canada's not that great either. Canada's really shitty to indigenous people and to foreigners trying to come in as well, especially in Quebec. Quebec has a huge problem with people trying to cross into their area, refugees, and some of them have to do this arduous journey in which how America has all those problems where you're crossing the border and you might get shot or you might starve or stuff like that. And this one, sometimes because it's really cold winters, I believe it was Nigerian refugees, their fingers were almost frozen off their hands because they'd done such a long journey into Canada and they were trying to end it. So everywhere you look, there's people doing terrible things. Independent on China's atrocities, the focus on them in the US is largely explained by xenophobia. I don't think it's largely explained by xenophobia. I think it's largely explained by them trying to turn China into this giant boogeyman right now, and has been for a while, right? The leading economic powerhouse that is contending the United States in the world sphere. At the same time, we're sleeping on the genocide in Yemen that we're funding, that both of us are funding. You Americans are funding it. We Canadians are funding it. We're all funding the genocide in Yemen. It's fucking, yeah, okay. Well, why don't we put a stop to that first? In the order of things that we have a tangible ability to stop, I have almost zero control in what goes on in China. Zero. I can talk about how I'm outraged by it because I am, as everyone should be. But again, what I could actually do right now is I could call my MP, which I did this morning. I was telling everybody, call your local governance, call your MPs, and ask for things, and tell them your demands. I was saying that I want Bill C-237 to be enacted in Canada. That is the Universal Basic Income Bill. I want that to pass because then we have UBI on a federal fucking level. That would be glorious. I'm a very big proponent of Universal Basic Income. I want that to pass. And yes, bring up the fact that I want to end all arms trade and sales to Saudi Arabia. All of it. Forever. Never again. You know, I'm like, let's just put an end to that. We don't need the petty cash that we get from doing this. And hey, if every single one of you does it in your region, who knows? Maybe we can enact some change. You don't control China. None of us do. Hey, even the people, here's something fun that you can have in your heart of hearts. Even people who are massive China stands on the left, who are like, oh yes, China is is my daddy. They're never going to be allowed to be Chinese. They won't. There's no such thing as immigrating to China and becoming a Chinese citizen. That doesn't exist. So they'll have to do it from afar. They'll have to worship from afar. You know, that's it. This is merely a question. I don't have a position yet. Is their concern also that China could be doing many terrible things, but we wouldn't be privy to it thanks to their total control over the institutions, while say in America and in the country it's not quite big like that. Big money can't fight the truth, doesn't have outright control, especially in the inclusion of the internet. I'm not totally sure I understand your question. I think one of the things that people should remember, because again, let's get to the nuance of this, is that China, in its growth, its economic growth, has done far more, and I say this as a way of saying, well, maybe you should catch up, America, far more to uplift people out of poverty in its rapid capitalist growth than America or any other nation has. And that is something that other countries should emulate. I'm not saying that there isn't massive amounts of disparity. There isn't huge income wealth gaps. I'm not. But you have to understand that China is not socialist. China is not communist. China is a state-run capitalist. It's like a company. Think of it as a state-owned corporation, and it's owned by the CCP and it's run by the CCP that does boast 90 million members. Yes, but the decision-making at the very top of the CCP happens to be done by a very small Politburo, and oftentimes there's a lot of exchanges and bartering that goes on behind the scenes in order to make things happen. So even if I grant you this, even if I say that it is the largest political body in the world, which it is by definition, 90 million members is a fuck ton, but that's still 8% of the Chinese population. So even at my most generous, 8% of the population is effectively making decisions for the vast majority. That is not a communist utopia. That is not a socialist utopia. And there's private business working in it as well. It has a mixed market economy, so it allows for international investment as well as having its own privatized control over its economy. A centrally planned committee, if you will. It resembles fascism far more than America does. I'm not gonna open up that can of worms, because fascism is something totally different. I mean, we have to define fascism very clearly, and not just the Starbucks way of saying when I don't like it as fascist. Is it a police state? Is it monitoring you? Is it giving you a social credit score? I think that's what you're referencing more, right? The way in which they do imperialism in Africa is significantly more humane. It is. That should be commended. It's more than any NATO country in terms of its investment and then expungement of debt in Africa. But that's not to say that it's not still exploiting African workers. Like a lot of the Chinese factories that have been built in African countries oftentimes are being built on what was previously farmland, and farmers are getting pushed out of their areas to make way for these large companies to build products that China is now using, as China used to be used in the past by the West, to effectively make and develop all these kind of cheap commodities that we love to buy because we love our cheap shit. So we used to buy them from China, and now China gets them manufactured in countries in Africa. This is capitalism. Like through and through. People have these weird blinders on when it comes to China. They either can't see and appreciate the things that it has done effectively and try to emulate some of those things in the West, and also at the same time completely oblivious to the fact that it is doing capitalism better than any other country on the fucking planet right now, and it's engaged in neoliberal trade just like any other country, because it has to be. That's how you have a world economy. That's how you do exchange. Like that's the problem when people are either like China bad, China good, one of the two. Like, no country is good or bad. Most countries are shit, but most of them are a mix of things. You should be looking towards the things within that country that work well and are just and ameliorate the lives for the most amount of people that give, like, you know, the workers of the world the most rights and powers. And the deals they've recently made with Iran, yes. But again, I'm not as saber-rattly against Iran as a lot of Americans are.
Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Can you do the thing, that thumbs up and comment and all those things that help us out in the algorithm that controls every aspect of our lives? Also, if you happen to have a Facebook account, can you delete it? Like, just delete it. You should probably delete your Facebook account because it's not a great company. But hey, if you can't do that for whatever reason, I understand. And could you also go to facebook.com/thesurftimes then and give us a little like and a follow. We're just trying to push back against the fact that people like Ben Shapiro happen to dominate the platform entirely. And when everyone asks why do older generations believe the things they believe, one of the problems is the majority of them on social media use Facebook. So to counter that, we're just going to be on there too now. Also, if you happen to have a union or a worker co-op or even a leftist project, podcast, website, Zoom, MySpace, it doesn't matter. We will advertise it for free on this channel. All you got to do is go to weareserfs.com and use the forms that we got there, weareserfs.com. Thanks, everybody.
To our glorious gods, Xander Corvus and I'm Rav, may you shower us with glory and smite our enemies. To our monarch, Tom Spiker, we serve at your leisure, your grace. To our lords, Tofox, Bisexual Black Gamer, Jimothy K. Meeble Beeps Jr., Ryan Lubin, Trevor R., Jeffrey Lamb, Alexander Thaler, and Hans Josephine, we shall carry your banner high into the fields of battle. To our Knights of the Round Table, Timothy Hart, Trevor Janis, Lemmy 101, Anthropophagic, Saren 42, Chronic de Hemphog, Kale Kotka, The Great Pudini, Bone Jenny, Catherine, Radical Maniac, Ramon Acosta, Incosin, J. Fraser Cartwright, Thomas Barrington, Jimmy Bignuts, Violent Orchard, Sophie Baby, Political Puppy, Andreas Chitoro, Gufalankius, Zach Christensen, Nicholas Marks, Yopi, Josh Mickelson, Melissa Murphy, Todd Buckingham, Todd Lajeunesse, Constance Joyce Lacheris. We lift our glasses of ale and we salute you.